Welcome in. Tonight, we're following one of the strangest questions evolution ever produced. Why does anything feel alive at all? Matter can react without awareness. A thermostat reacts to temperature. A plant turns toward sunlight. Even simple organisms can move toward food and away from danger without ever experiencing the world internally. So somewhere along the history of life, something changed. Electrochemical signals became sensation. Information processing became experience. Matter began somehow to notice itself, and no one fully understands why. What advantage does awareness actually provide? Why should evolution produce a creature capable not only of surviving, but of feeling fear, wonder, memory, loneliness, curiosity, even the strange awareness of its own existence? Tonight, we follow that question backward. Through fossils, through nervous systems, through dreams, memory, language, and the fragile story the mind tells itself every morning when it wakes up. Not to force an answer, just to sit beside the mystery long enough to see what begins to emerge. Before the story settles in, just a brief note. This video is built for low light, soft narration, and background ambience that stays gentle instead of pulling attention. You can leave a small note with where in the world you are listening from, if you are comfortable sharing it generally. If this helps you rest, subscribing lets the channel know to keep making more slow stories like this. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. No fossil records of feeling. Only a shell. A groove in stone. A shape pressed into rock so long ago the ocean that covered it no longer exists. And somehow, from fragments like these, we ended up asking one of the strangest questions imaginable. Why does anything feel alive at all? Not just react, not just move. Feel. Because evolution can explain claws, eyes, teeth, speed, camouflage. Every feature earns its place by helping something survive long enough to reproduce. But awareness is different. A creature can dodge danger without ever experiencing fear. A nervous system can process signals automatically, the way a thermostat reacts to temperature. So why would evolution go further than that? Why create an inner world? Why produce the strange, private sensation of being someone? Tonight, we follow that question backward. Through fossils, through ancient oceans, through the first nervous systems and the first eyes. Not to force an answer, but to sit beside the mystery long enough to see what begins to emerge. And before we begin, just a small note. This video is designed for slow listening, soft light, and a quieter pace than the world usually allows. If you'd like, you can leave a comment sharing where you're listening from tonight. I always like seeing how far these stories travel in the dark. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The fossil that couldn't remember. A fossil can preserve almost anything except the one thing we most want to know. It can preserve teeth sharp enough to crack shells, tiny joints in the legs of an ancient arthropod, even the path an animal dragged through wet mud 500 million years ago. but it cannot preserve experience. No fossil records fear, or curiosity, or pain, or the first dim awareness that there was a world outside the body at all. You can hold a trilobite fossil in your hand and stare into the empty sockets where eyes once sat. You can imagine it crawling slowly across the seabed beneath a cold prehistoric ocean. But there is no trace of what it was like to be that creature. That absence is unsettling once you notice it, because the fossil record tells us exactly when bodies changed, when spines appeared, when fins evolved, when jaws emerged, but the inner life of those creatures vanished completely. Stone remembers structure, not sensation, and yet awareness must have appeared somewhere. At some point in Earth's history, life crossed an invisible threshold. Matter stopped merely reacting and started experiencing. Or at least, that's what it feels like from inside our own minds. The difficulty is that consciousness leaves no imprint behind. A paleontologist can study the thickness of a shell and estimate the pressure of ancient oceans. They can analyze fossilized burrows and reconstruct how an animal moved through sediment. But they cannot excavate a thought. No layer of rock contains the first moment an organism noticed danger instead of merely responding to it. That line between reaction and experience may be the hardest boundary in all of science because it leaves no direct evidence, only hints. Sometimes researchers try to infer behavior from traces left behind, a sudden turn in an ancient trackway, a burrow that loops back on itself, a hunting pattern frozen into stone. Did the animal hesitate? Did it choose? Did it anticipate? Or was it all automatic? The fossil never answers. It simply remains there in silence, like a footprint without the person. And the more you think about it, the stranger awareness becomes. Because from evolution's perspective, consciousness looks expensive. Brains consume enormous amounts of energy. Human brains burn through calories constantly, despite making up only a small portion of the body. Even simple nervous systems require resources to build and maintain. So if reflexes alone can keep an organism alive, why develop conscious experience at all? Why not remain mechanical? After all, most life on Earth probably is. Bacteria thrive without thoughts. Plants survive without inner monologues. Even many animals may operate mostly through instinct and automatic response, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if awareness was never the goal? What if consciousness emerged accidentally? Some scientists suspect exactly that. One idea is that awareness began as a side effect of increasingly complex nervous systems. As brains evolved to process more information, an internal model of the world may have appeared automatically, not because evolution aimed for consciousness, but because enough interconnected processing eventually created the sensation of being, like a mirror accidentally reflecting itself. Other theories suggest consciousness helps organisms simulate possibilities before acting. Instead of relying purely on reflex, a conscious creature can imagine outcomes, predict danger, and adapt more flexibly. In that sense, awareness may function less like magic and more like an advanced survival tool, a virtual rehearsal space inside the mind. But even if that's true, it still doesn't explain the deepest part of the mystery. Why should processing information feel like anything at all? A computer processes information constantly. So does a calculator. So does the nervous system of a jellyfish. But none of those systems necessarily contain a private inner world. Somewhere between simple reaction and conscious awareness, something changed, and nobody knows exactly where. Maybe the first flicker of awareness was unimaginably faint. Not thoughts or language or identity, just the dim sensation of light and dark, hunger and safety, pain and relief. A tiny spark inside an ancient nervous system drifting through primordial seas. If that moment happened, it may have been one of the most important transitions in the history of the universe, and absolutely nothing in the fossil record can prove it. That is what makes these ancient stones feel oddly haunting. Every fossil represents a creature that moved through a real world. It hunted, hid, fed, escaped. But whether it ever experienced its own existence remains permanently out of reach. The shell survives. The mind does not. And maybe that gap is why fossils affect people so deeply. Because when we look at them, we are staring directly at the boundary between matter and experience, between a body and the possibility that somewhere inside it there was once a point of view. Next, we follow the story into the living world itself, into the oceans where the first senses emerged, and where evolution may have discovered that seeing the world changes everything. Chapter 2. The first eyes opened. For most of Earth's history, life existed in darkness, without ever truly seeing the world around it. The oceans were filled with movement, but almost none of it involved awareness in the way we imagine it now. Creatures drifted, crawled, reacted to chemicals in the water. Some could sense warmth. Others could detect pressure or vibration. But sensing is not the same as seeing, and seeing changed everything, because the moment an organism could form even the faintest image of the world beyond itself, evolution entered an entirely new kind of arms race. Not just survival anymore. Prediction. The earliest eyes were almost absurdly simple. Not eyes in the modern sense, but tiny patches of light-sensitive cells scattered across primitive bodies. They couldn't see shapes. They couldn't recognize predators. They couldn't admire a sunrise over prehistoric water. They could only detect one thing: light, or its absence. But even that small ability carried enormous power. A creature that sensed shadows overhead might avoid becoming food. One that could distinguish day from night might know when to feed or hide. And once evolution discovered that information about the outside world improved survival, it began refining the system relentlessly. A shallow patch became a curved cup. A curved cup narrowed into a pinhole. Eventually, lenses appeared. And slowly, over millions upon millions of years, the world came into focus. There's something eerie about imagining the first creature that truly saw another organism clearly. Not just movement, not just brightness, but form. a separate body moving through space with intention. Because vision does more than collect information. Vision creates distance between the self and the world. It turns reality into something observed. Some scientists believe this shift may have pushed awareness itself forward. Once an animal could build detailed internal maps of its environment, nervous systems became dramatically more complex. Decisions had to happen faster. Movements had to become predictive instead of reactive. And somewhere inside that growing complexity, subjective experience may have deepened too. Not all at once. Not like a switch flipping on. More like dawn arriving slowly enough that nobody notices exactly when night ended. You can still see traces of these ancient beginnings in modern animals. Flatworms possess crude eye spots that only detect light direction, see-through compound eyes, built from thousands of tiny visual units. Octopuses evolved camera-like eyes, remarkably similar to our own, despite following an entirely separate evolutionary path. Again and again, evolution kept rediscovering vision because seeing works. But vision also introduced something else into nature. Fear at a distance. Before eyesight, danger often arrived through touch. A predator encountered prey almost by accident. After eyesight, creatures could track each other across open water, hunt strategically, anticipate movement before contact ever occurred. The ocean became psychologically different, a place where something could already be watching you from far away. Some paleontologists think this visual arms race helped trigger the Cambrian explosion, the sudden burst of complex life roughly 540 million years ago. Once organisms could see, hiding mattered more. Armor mattered more. Speed mattered more. Bodies became stranger, more specialized, more elaborate. Eyes reshaped evolution itself, and strangely, the more life learned to observe the world, the more the world may have started existing internally as experience. Because vision is not passive. Your brain does not simply receive reality like a camera recording footage. It actively constructs a model from incomplete information. Even now, your mind fills blind spots automatically. It stabilizes motion, predicts shapes, generates color from wavelengths that have no inherent color at all. In a sense, what you experience is already a simulation built by the nervous system, not fake, but interpreted. Which raises another uncomfortable possibility. Maybe consciousness began when organisms stopped merely reacting to reality and started modeling it internally. Not just sensing danger, but representing danger. Not just detecting light, but constructing a world. If so, awareness may not be a separate thing added onto biology. It may simply emerge whenever information becomes organized deeply enough into an internal perspective. A world experienced from somewhere. And yet, even that idea leaves enormous questions unanswered. Because a map is not the same thing as experience. A machine can build models. A computer can process visual information. Modern AI systems can identify faces, objects, movement, even emotion. But does any of it feel like something from the inside? Nobody knows. And that uncertainty loops us back to those first ancient eyes opening beneath prehistoric seas. At what point did visual processing stop being mechanical? and become experiential? At what point did an organism stop functioning like a system and begin existing as a subject? There may never be a clean answer. Only gradients, only approximations, only increasingly complicated nervous systems staring outward into an increasingly detailed world. Still, there's something strangely intimate about the fact that every creature alive today inherits those first experiments in perception. Every eye carries the history of ancient oceans inside it. Every moment you look around your room, your brain performs processes shaped by hundreds of millions of years of survival, prediction, and adaptation. And somewhere beneath all that processing sits the quietest mystery of all: why any of it should feel like anything. Next, we move deeper into the brain itself, into memory, selfhood, and the possibility that consciousness may not be a stable thing at all, but a story the mind keeps telling itself moment by moment. If you would like to skip ahead a minute, now would be the time, as I'd like to talk to you about Nudge It Budget. Nudge It Budget is a free budgeting tool that runs right in your browser. No login, no linking your cards, and no collecting your personal financial data. It was built for people who want to make sense of their money without getting locked into complicated apps, subscriptions, or spreadsheets that take more work than they're worth. Nudge It. Budget gives you a simple place to organize your finances, understand where your money is going, and start building toward financial independence. Free, useful, private, and actually easy to start using. Start planning today at nudgeitbudget.com. And when you're done, don't forget to save your budget to your computer so you can load it back up next time. That's nudgeitbudget.com. Free, private, and built to help you finally get a clear picture of your finances. Chapter 3. The Burrow and the Choice. What does a worm risk when it pokes its head above the soil? Survival? Exposure? Something more subtle? The faint spark of awareness that there is a world beyond its damp tunnel. Life for most creatures is simple. Move toward warmth. Pull away from discomfort. Drift toward food. A worm buried in moist earth does not consult forecasts or plan strategy. It senses the world directly. Pressure against its body, minerals in the soil, faint vibrations from moles above. Most of the time, the worm obeys instinct. Wet soil. It inches upward. Dry ground. It coils deeper. But occasionally, something interrupts the automatic flow. The worm halts at the edge of its burrow, just long enough to weigh a choice. Venture into the open for food, or remain safe in the darkness. This pause is the first whisper of awareness. Not thought as we know it, but a primitive form of risk assessment. The worm notices the world beyond its immediate body. It senses potential danger. It senses possibility. Some biologists call these moments proto-consciousness, a system registering the world and its own state simultaneously. Not a mind, not reflection, but enough for something like hesitation to exist. A shadow above the soil, a drop of rain, the decision to move or not, is recorded only in action. Yet it is real. The burrow itself is a microcosm. Darkness, moisture, safe walls. Outside, the world is unpredictable. Predators, changing conditions, competition. The worm's nervous system must translate environmental cues into adaptive motion. Each choice, however small, carries consequence. Leave, risk exposure. Stay, risk hunger. This is awareness at its rawest, the intersection of sensation and potential. Evolutionary advantage emerges here. Organisms capable of assessing risk, even minimally, gain a subtle edge. A pause, a glance upward, a shift in movement. Survival depends on noticing more than the immediate stimulus. Even now, you can imagine it. A tiny body pressing against cold soil, sensing the vibration of life above. Hesitation. A faint calculation. The worm does not know it is aware. It only feels the pull of two possibilities and responds. And that is the heart of Chapter 3. Choices start small. Awareness begins quietly. The world outside exists before it is fully experienced. Next, we trace how those small moments scale, building the nervous systems that can perceive, remember, and eventually imagine the world beyond immediate survival. Chapter 4. The creature that stayed awake. Night settles differently when survival depends on someone else noticing danger before you do. Outside a burrow carved into dry earth, a meerkat stands upright against the fading light. Its tail braces against the ground. Its eyes scan the horizon slowly, endlessly, while the rest of the group curls together nearby in warm knots of fur and breathing. Most of them are asleep. One of them is not, because in social species, awareness stops being an individual problem. It becomes shared. And that changes evolution in strange ways. A lone animal only needs to track its own survival. Hunger, shelter, predators. But the moment creatures begin living in groups, awareness expands outward. Suddenly, survival depends on reading others too. Their posture, their breathing, their tension, their fear. A social animal lives partly inside the nervous systems of the creatures around it. That's what makes the meerkat standing guard feel oddly familiar. The role is practical, of course. Someone has to stay awake while the others sleep. Otherwise, the first sign of danger arrives as teeth in the dark. But the cost is real. The sentry sacrifices rest. Muscles stiffen in the cold air. Eyes strain against endless false alarms. Shifting grass, distant insects, shadows pretending to move. Most nights, nothing happens, until one night does. And evolution cares far more about that one night. What's fascinating is how quickly awareness begins spreading through a group once animals evolve social behavior. A single creature hears a sound. Its body tenses slightly. Another notices the movement. A third reacts before understanding why. Fear ripples outward faster than language ever could. Sometimes no sound is necessary at all. Among many social species, information travels through tiny physical changes, almost impossible to notice consciously. A flick of the tail, a pause in movement, a sudden stillness. The group behaves like a shared nervous system, distributed across multiple bodies. And once you start noticing this, human life begins looking less individual than we pretend. A parent wakes instantly at the sound of a child coughing down the hallway. Someone senses tension entering a room before a single word is spoken. An entire crowd becomes uneasy without knowing exactly why. Awareness leaks between people constantly. The strange part is that evolution appears willing to pay enormous costs for this shared sensitivity. Social awareness is exhausting. It means interrupted sleep, constant vigilance, monitoring relationships, expressions, status, danger. For highly social animals, the brain stops processing only the physical environment and starts tracking invisible social realities too. Who is trusted? Who is angry? Who outranks whom? Who might leave? Who might betray the group? A solitary predator can focus almost entirely on the external world. A social creature must carry an internal model of other minds, and that may have changed consciousness permanently. Some scientists suspect advanced awareness emerged partly because social living demanded increasingly sophisticated prediction. To survive in groups, animals needed to anticipate behavior before it happened. Not just, is there danger nearby? But, what is that other creature about to do? That requirement may have accelerated the evolution of memory, emotional interpretation, communication, empathy, deception, even self-awareness itself. Because eventually, predicting others forces a strange realization. They have perspectives too. A rival wants things. A parent protects offspring. A companion remembers. A member of the group watches you the same way you watch them. And once an organism begins modeling the minds of others, it may eventually turn that model inward. Perhaps self-awareness began there. Not alone in silence, but reflected back through social life. There's an unsettling beauty in that possibility. The conscious self may not have evolved purely to understand the physical world. It may have evolved to navigate each other, to read faces, interpret emotion, track alliances, maintain belonging. In other words, consciousness may partly be a survival strategy for living among minds. And nowhere does that feel clearer than at night. Because nighttime strips social awareness down to its oldest form, watchfulness. One creature remains awake while others surrender consciousness temporarily to sleep. Listening, scanning, waiting. The group survives because awareness continues somewhere. Even dreams seem shaped by this ancient social wiring. Sleeping animals twitch at imagined threats. Humans wake from anxiety dreams carrying emotions generated entirely inside the brain. A sudden movement from one sleeper can disturb everyone nearby. Nervous systems synchronize more than we realize. The boundary between one mind and another is less stable than it appears. Modern neuroscience still struggles to explain exactly how shared awareness functions at deeper levels. Some theories suggest consciousness grows richer when systems become highly interconnected internally. Others argue social complexity drove intelligence by forcing brains to simulate increasingly detailed models of other individuals. The mathematics become dense quickly, but the emotional truth underneath them feels ancient and simple. To live together is to partially carry each other's fears, which means awareness stopped being solitary long before humans arrived. Out there in darkness, beneath cold skies and shifting grass, generations of social animals stayed awake for one another, listening for danger, trading signals, passing information across bodies and nervous systems until the group itself behaved like something larger than any individual inside it. A temporary collective mind built from glances, tension, memory, and trust. And somewhere inside that long evolutionary chain, the human experience emerged too. Not isolated consciousness, but consciousness echoing between people in the dark. Chapter 5. The creature that disappears every night. Sleep is one of the strangest things evolution ever allowed, because every night, awareness vanishes willingly. A badger curls beneath leaves inside a cold den. A cat folds itself beneath a rough blanket near fading warmth. Birds tuck their heads beneath their wings while darkness spreads across the reeds. And for hours at a time, the world continues without them. No watching, no guarding, no certainty, just vulnerability. Which raises a question that becomes more unsettling the longer you sit with it. Why would evolution spend hundreds of millions of years building awareness, only to switch it off every night? A sleeping animal is defenseless in ways waking life rarely allows. Muscles loosen. Reaction times disappear. Attention collapses inward. Outside the den, predators still move through the dark. Hunger still exists. Weather still shifts. The world does not pause simply because consciousness has gone missing for a while. And yet, nearly every animal with a complex nervous system sleeps. Not occasionally, not by accident, constantly. Sleep appears so deeply woven into biology that even tiny creatures with microscopic brains drift through cycles of activity and rest. Fish slow themselves into stillness beneath currents. Insects enter dormant states. Dolphins sleep with only half their brain at a time so they can continue surfacing for air. Awareness bends itself into strange shapes just to survive the need for sleep, which suggests something important. The cost of staying awake forever may be worse than the danger of unconsciousness. At first glance, The explanation seems practical enough. Bodies need repair. Cells need maintenance. Energy must be restored. That part makes intuitive sense. You would not run a machine forever without stopping to cool it, clean it, recalibrate it. But sleep goes far beyond simple rest, because sleep does not merely reduce activity. It interrupts experience itself. The mind doesn't idle quietly in the background while remaining fully aware. It falls away almost completely. Muscles twitch. Time fractures. Consciousness dissolves into dreams, or disappears into blankness altogether. For several hours each night, the self temporarily stops maintaining reality, and nobody fully understands why. Modern neuroscience offers theories, but none close the mystery completely. One possibility is that sleep helps clear accumulated noise from the brain. Throughout the day, neurons strengthen countless connections while processing experience. Sleep may help reorganize those networks, reinforcing important memories while trimming unnecessary ones away, like cleaning old papers from an overcrowded desk. There's evidence for this. During sleep, the brain appears to replay experiences from waking life. Rats navigating mazes show similar neural firing patterns while asleep, as though their brains rehearse the memory repeatedly in darkness. Dreams may partly emerge from this process. Not random hallucinations exactly, but fragments of memory, prediction, fear, and imagination colliding while the brain reorganizes itself, which explains why dreams often feel emotionally real, despite making very little logical sense. A hallway becomes an ocean. A childhood home contains impossible rooms. Someone long gone appears beside you speaking normally, and during the dream, you rarely question any of it. The sleeping mind accepts unstable reality with surprising ease. That alone feels philosophically dangerous once you notice it. Because if consciousness can generate convincing worlds internally every night, how stable is waking perception really? Perhaps ordinary reality already depends on constant neurological maintenance more than we realize. Sleep exposes the seams. You can see hints of this in animals. A cat sleeping beneath a worn blanket suddenly twitches as though chasing prey through invisible grass. Its paws jerk slightly. Whiskers tremble. Somewhere inside its nervous system, an entire unseen world unfolds. The body lies motionless in one place, while the mind moves elsewhere entirely. Awareness becomes divided against itself. And there's a strange irony hidden there. The blanket protecting the sleeper also weakens the senses needed for survival. Every sleeping creature exists in temporary surrender. The guard lowers. The world keeps moving. Consciousness slips away anyway, which makes sleep feel less like a choice and more like a biological demand no nervous system fully escapes. Even humans, with locked doors, heated homes, artificial light, and modern medicine, remain helpless before exhaustion eventually pulls awareness under. The brain insists, and the consequences of resisting sleep are severe enough to become frightening quickly. Memory deteriorates. Emotions destabilize. Perception begins distorting. hallucinations emerge. A mind deprived of sleep slowly loses its grip on reality itself. That detail matters because it hints at something deeper. Consciousness may require periodic interruption to remain coherent, like a fire that burns incorrectly unless allowed to settle and rebuild. Some researchers describe sleep as the brain resetting predictive systems overwhelmed by sensory input. Others focus on metabolic cleaning processes that occur more actively during sleep. Some theories emphasize learning, memory consolidation, emotional regulation, or neural optimization. Each explanation captures part of the picture. None fully explain why subjective awareness must repeatedly disappear in order to function. Machines process information continuously. Computers do not dream. Servers do not hallucinate narratives in darkness before rebooting emotionally at sunrise. But biological minds do, which suggests consciousness may not simply be information processing alone. It may depend on rhythms, cycles, alternating states of integration and collapse. Perhaps awareness is less stable than it feels during waking life, not a constant flame, but a pattern that must repeatedly dissolve and reconstruct itself. That idea becomes difficult to ignore in the moments just before waking. There's often a strange transition period where identity returns gradually. The world sharpens slowly. Memory reconnects piece by piece. For a few seconds, you exist somewhere between dream and reality, not fully belonging to either one, almost as though consciousness has to reboot itself every morning. And maybe that's the real puzzle of sleep, not simply why awareness disappears, but why it comes back, night after night, fragile, interrupted, temporarily absent, and yet somehow able to rebuild the feeling of being someone all over again by dawn. Chapter 6. The Creature in the Glass. A mirror is a strangely dangerous object. Not physically dangerous, psychologically dangerous. Because for most animals, a reflection is not a reflection at all. It is another creature, a rival, a stranger, something staring back with impossible precision. Inside a quiet research room, a chimpanzee sits in front of a scratched metal mirror, bolted low against the wall. Fingerprints smear the glass. The animal leans forward slowly, studying the figure in front of it with unsettling concentration. Then it reaches toward its own forehead. Not the mirror, itself. And with that tiny movement, one of evolution's strangest thresholds appears. Because recognizing yourself is not necessary for survival. A lion does not need self-awareness to hunt. A shark does not question its identity before attacking prey. Most animals move through life without ever realizing they are separate beings observed from the outside. They simply react. Eat, escape, mate, sleep. For millions of years, awareness only needed to point outward toward the world. Food, threats, movement, opportunity. But somewhere along the evolutionary path, a few minds became complicated enough to turn awareness back onto themselves. And nobody fully understands why. The mirror test sounds deceptively simple. Researchers place a visible mark somewhere on an animal's body, usually on the forehead or face, in a spot that cannot be seen directly. Then, the animal is placed before a mirror. If it treats the reflection as another animal, the test is considered failed. But if the animal uses the mirror to investigate its own body, touching the mark, examining itself, recognizing the reflection as me, the implication becomes difficult to ignore. Something inside that mind understands identity. Chimpanzees pass. Dolphins sometimes pass. Elephants have passed. Even magpies, small black and white birds with surprisingly advanced cognition, have shown signs of self-recognition. Most animals do not. Dogs often bark or lose interest entirely. Cats glance behind the mirror, searching for the other animal. Fish attack the reflection endlessly. The image never becomes self. And maybe that's because selfhood itself is stranger than it feels. You experience being you so continuously that it seems natural, almost inevitable. But evolution never guaranteed this perspective would exist. A nervous system could theoretically process information, react intelligently, even solve problems without ever generating a stable internal identity. In fact, much of human behavior already happens automatically. You begin walking before consciously deciding. You reach for your phone without remembering why. You finish sentences before fully planning them. Awareness often arrives after the machinery has already started moving, which makes the mirror test unsettling in a very specific way, because the animal staring into the glass is not merely processing visual information anymore. It is processing itself as an object inside the world, and that changes cognition profoundly. Some scientists believe self-awareness emerged accidentally as brains became increasingly sophisticated at modeling reality. The more a creature predicts the environment, remembers the past, and anticipates social behavior, the more likely it becomes that the brain eventually constructs a model of its own existence too. A loop forms. The system observing the world begins observing itself, observing the world. And once that loop closes, consciousness changes shape. The mirror simply exposes the process externally. There may also be a social reason for this development. Highly social animals survive partly by predicting the thoughts and intentions of others. An ape navigating alliances inside a troop benefits enormously from understanding what another member might know, want, fear, or remember. But to simulate another mind effectively, the brain may first need a model of its own. In other words, the ability to recognize yourself may have evolved because understanding others required a reference point. Selfhood as social technology. That possibility becomes strangely emotional when you think about loneliness. Because if consciousness partly evolved for navigating relationships, then perhaps the feeling of being isolated cuts so deeply because the mind itself was shaped in connection with other minds from the beginning. Even human infants do not immediately recognize themselves in mirrors. For months, a baby may smile at the reflection as though another child lives inside the glass. Gradually, almost invisibly, something changes. The connection forms. That's me. No one remembers the moment it happened for them, personally, which feels fitting somehow. One day the world simply contained a self. And ever since then, we have carried that invisible identity through every experience without fully understanding what it is. The mirror itself remains ordinary, just glass, metal, light bouncing predictably across surfaces. But the meaning created inside the observer is anything but ordinary, because once a creature recognizes itself, entirely new psychological possibilities appear. Embarrassment, pride, shame, performance, self-consciousness, identity. A mind can now imagine how it appears to others, and eventually, perhaps, how it appears across time. That may be the real threshold hidden inside the mirror test. Not intelligence alone, not perception alone, but the birth of an internal character the brain begins treating as someone, a self that can be remembered, protected, improved, judged, narrated. A self that can wonder about its own existence while staring silently into glass. And maybe that is why mirrors feel slightly uncanny even now. Because somewhere deep beneath habit, the brain still recognizes how strange this ability really is. Matter looking at itself and knowing. Chapter 7. The body that wanted things. A hungry stomach does not ask politely. It interrupts. A hollow ache spreads beneath the ribs. Attention narrows. Thoughts become strangely repetitive. The body keeps sending the same message again and again until something changes. Eat. Few forces in evolution are older than that signal. Long before language, before memory, before self-awareness, living things were already being pushed and pulled by discomfort. Even a worm buried deep in wet soil will slowly twist toward food if given enough time. A bacterium drifts toward sugar and away from acid without ever knowing what either one is. The body moves first. Awareness comes later. Which raises a strange possibility. What if consciousness began not as intelligence, but as a way of tracking needs? Not philosophy, not identity, just discomfort becoming impossible to ignore. Because the earliest nervous systems did not need to understand the world deeply. They only needed to answer simple questions. Am I safe? Am I starving? Should I move? Should I stay? And feelings turned out to be extremely efficient answers. Pain says stop. Hunger says search. Fear says hide. Warmth says remain here. Emotion may have started as biology's shortcut system, a way to prioritize action before reasoning ever existed. You can almost picture one of those early animals now, half buried in cold sand beneath shallow water. The current shifts overhead. Somewhere nearby, food drifts through the tide. Inside the small nervous system, competing signals collide. Stay hidden. Search for food. Avoid exposure. Move toward relief. Nothing philosophical happens there. No inner monologue. No reflection about existence. Just pressure. a body trying to correct itself. And maybe that's the first real form of awareness. The realization, however faint, that something feels wrong. Modern consciousness still works this way, more than people like admitting. Most thoughts do not appear from pure logic. They emerge from needs already shaping attention underneath awareness. A headache makes the world feel harsher. Loneliness changes perception. Exhaustion shrinks patience. Anxiety rearranges priorities before conscious reasoning catches up. The body quietly edits reality from below, which may explain why feelings are so difficult to ignore, even when they make no rational sense. Because evolution did not design emotions to be accurate. It designed them to be effective. Fear keeps organisms alive even when it overreacts. Hunger motivates survival, even when it becomes obsessive. Loneliness pushes social connection, because isolated humans historically died more easily. Feelings distort reality constantly, but distortion can still be adaptive. The brain is less like a detached scientist observing the world objectively, and more like a survival machine assigning urgency to whatever matters most right now. And urgency changes perception itself. Food tastes better when starving. Threats appear larger when anxious. Time slows during danger. Relief floods the body when safety returns. Awareness is not neutral. It is weighted. Some neuroscientists believe this weighting process sits near the core of consciousness itself. A purely logical machine could process information endlessly without caring about any outcome. But biological organisms cannot survive without priorities. Something must matter. Pain matters. Warmth matters. Belonging matters. Without feeling, the world becomes flat. Information without importance, and importance may be what transforms raw sensation into experience. You can see hints of this throughout animal behavior. Rats will press levers repeatedly for rewards, even when they no longer need food. Monkeys solve puzzles partly out of curiosity. Octopuses explore unfamiliar objects with something that looks suspiciously like interest. Motivation spills beyond pure survival surprisingly quickly. The nervous system begins wanting things, not merely reacting. Wanting. That distinction feels small at first. It changes everything. Because once a creature can remember discomfort and anticipate relief, behavior becomes more flexible across time. An animal avoids the berry bush that caused sickness yesterday, stores food before winter, remembers dangerous locations, learns patterns. The future starts influencing the present. And perhaps that is where consciousness deepened most dramatically. Not in perception alone, but in anticipation. The ability to suffer before pain arrives. To crave before hunger becomes unbearable. To imagine relief before reaching it. Human beings carry this system to extraordinary extremes. A mild craving can dominate attention for hours. Embarrassment can replay inside the mind for years. Anxiety can generate fear about events that never actually happen. The body's ancient motivational machinery now operates inside a brain capable of simulation, memory, prediction, and abstraction, which means modern consciousness is filled with ghosts of future discomfort. A person lying awake at night, worrying about tomorrow, is still running survival software shaped millions of years ago, just with far more imagination attached. And imagination complicates suffering enormously. Animals experience pain mostly in the present moment. Humans experience anticipated pain, remembered pain, symbolic pain. A sentence can hurt. A memory can ache physically. An imagined future can trigger stress hormones before anything occurs. Awareness magnifies need, but it also unlocks planning. The same mind capable of anxiety can prepare for winter, build shelter, save resources, avoid poison, care for children, invent medicine, and imagine futures beyond immediate survival. Consciousness hurts partly because prediction helps. That may be the evolutionary bargain hidden underneath feeling itself. Suffering became more personal, so survival could become more flexible. And somewhere inside that trade-off, the modern human mind emerged. A nervous system constantly balancing discomfort against desire, fear against curiosity, need against imagination. A creature shaped not only by what it sees, but by what it cannot stop wanting. Chapter 8. The fire that let minds escape the body. Before language, awareness was trapped inside individual skulls. A creature could feel fear, pain, hunger, curiosity. But those experiences died with the body that carried them. Then somewhere in the dark, beside a fire burning low against cold stone, something changed. A human being pointed into the night and transferred experience into another mind. That may have been one of the most important moments in the history of consciousness. Not because language made humans intelligent, but because language allowed awareness to spread. In a cave in northern Spain, archaeologists uncovered a circle of blackened stones buried beneath layers of ash. Charred bones lay scattered nearby beside cracked flint tools, darkened by smoke. Nothing dramatic remains. No names. No written record. No preserved voices. Just burned rock and soot pressed into sediment. But the evidence says something unmistakable. People stayed here long enough to gather around fire together. And once you picture that scene clearly, the silence becomes strangely crowded. Someone feeding sticks into the coals. Someone rubbing cold hands near the heat. Someone coughing as smoke drifts sideways through the cave. Voices rising and falling against stone walls, while darkness presses just beyond the firelight. The old cliché says fire kept predators away. But fire also created something stranger. A circle where minds could overlap. Because language does more than communicate information. It allows one nervous system to alter another without physical contact. A warning enters through the ears and changes future behavior. A story creates fear about dangers never personally encountered. A memory survives the death of the person who first experienced it. Awareness escapes biology and enters culture. That transition changes evolution itself. A wolf learns only from what happens directly to it. A human can inherit lessons from people long dead. Don't drink from that river. The winter after heavy rain is worse. Those berries made your uncle sick. Information no longer disappears when a single organism dies. It accumulates. And storytelling may have accelerated that process more than any other human behavior. Stories compress survival into emotion. A list of facts is easy to forget, but fear, tension, embarrassment, danger, relief, those linger. You remember the story about the hunter who ignored warnings near the river at night. You remember the dream someone described beside the fire. You remember the strange feeling in the room when everyone went quiet at the same moment. Emotion makes memory contagious. And once minds began sharing internal experiences through language, consciousness itself may have changed shape. Because talking forces awareness inward. A creature reacting silently to the world does not necessarily think about itself very much. But the moment you describe an experience aloud, something unusual happens. You hear your own mind reflected back at you. Language creates distance between the thinker and the thought. You stop merely feeling fear. You begin saying, "I was afraid." Yet subtle shift matters enormously. The self becomes narratable. And once the self becomes narratable, identity starts stabilizing across time. A person can now remember who they were yesterday, explain what they want tomorrow, describe dreams, justify choices, invent stories about themselves. Consciousness becomes partly constructed through narration. Some neuroscientists and philosophers suspect this may explain why human awareness feels so unusually layered compared to other animals. We are not only experiencing reality, we are continuously telling ourselves stories about the experience while it happens. That narration never fully stops. You replay conversations internally. Imagine future scenarios. Explain your own emotions to yourself after they occur. Turn memories into personal mythology. The mind becomes both actor and audience simultaneously. And around ancient fires, that process likely expanded outward into groups. A single frightening experience could now reshape dozens of minds at once through storytelling alone. Someone describes a predator in the valley. Everyone listening feels tension, despite never seeing the animal themselves. A private fear becomes collective imagination. That may be one reason humans became so psychologically different from other species. Language allows imagined realities to influence behavior almost as strongly as physical reality itself. Money, religion, nations, laws, history, myths, all are shared fictions maintained through collective belief and repeated storytelling. Human civilization runs partly on narratives passed from one nervous system into another. And yet something remains impossible to transfer completely. You can describe pain, but not fully deliver the feeling itself. You can explain grief, but another person still experiences only their own version of it. Even perfect language leaves a gap between minds. That gap may never close, which makes the ancient campfire feel strangely bittersweet. Because storytelling lets awareness travel farther than biology alone ever could. But consciousness still remains trapped inside individual experience at the same time. The people around the fire may laugh at the same story, fear the same darkness, stare into the same flames. Yet each person still sits alone inside their own mind. The fire burns lower. Voices soften. One by one, the group falls silent. Eventually, only the coals remain glowing against the stone. And thousands of years later, all that survives are blackened rocks buried beneath ash. Physical traces left behind by minds trying, for a little while, to escape the isolation of being conscious alone. Chapter 9. The map the mind carries. A creature without memory can only react. It touches fire, feels pain, pulls away. Then the moment disappears. No lesson remains. No warning survives. No future changes because of the past. Memory changes that. It allows life to carry experience forward. And once that happens, awareness stops living entirely in the present moment. Tonight's object is simple. An old ledger resting open beneath dim light. Thick paper warped with age. Ink bleeding slightly at the edges where a tired hand once pressed too hard with the pen. Beside it lies a hand-drawn map. Rivers sketched unevenly. Roads fading into uncertain terrain. A world captured imperfectly enough to be useful. Both objects perform the same strange task. They preserve the past so the future can be navigated more safely. And in many ways, that is exactly what memory is. Not perfect storage, not objective truth. A survival tool, because instinct alone can only carry a creature so far. Instinct says, freeze, run, hide, hunt. But memory says, last time this happened, something went wrong. That distinction changes everything. A worm buried in wet soil may recoil automatically from a painful stimulus, but it does not sit underground replaying yesterday's mistakes. Its body adjusts chemically. The lesson exists inside altered reactions, not conscious recollection. But once nervous systems become complex enough to store patterns internally, the past begins shaping behavior in far more flexible ways. An animal remembers which water source contained predators, which path led toward food, which sound came before danger. Experience accumulates, and suddenly, evolution no longer has to encode every survival strategy genetically from scratch. The individual can learn. That may have transformed awareness as profoundly as vision or language ever did, because memory allows the mind to escape the immediate present. A creature capable of remembering can now suffer from things that are no longer happening and prepare for things that have not happened yet. That sounds obvious until you realize how strange it really is. Right now, your brain carries thousands of invisible maps built from experience. You avoid roads where you nearly crashed. Remember rooms where difficult conversations happened. Feel uneasy hearing certain songs because they became attached to old emotions years ago. The past quietly edits the present constantly, often before awareness even catches up. You touch a hot stove and pull your hand away before consciously processing pain. You walk around obstacles while distracted because your brain already predicts the environment automatically. You recognize danger in someone's expression before fully understanding why. Memory and reflex overlap so deeply that separating them becomes difficult, which raises an unsettling possibility. Much of what feels like conscious choice may actually be remembered prediction happening beneath awareness first. The brain is less like a passive recording device and more like a forecasting system built from accumulated experience. It studies patterns, builds internal maps, anticipates outcomes, and those maps are never perfectly accurate. That's where the ledger becomes important, because written records reveal both the power and fragility of memory at the same time. An old financial ledger tracks debts, names, harvests, promises. A map tracks roads, borders, rivers. Both attempt to stabilize reality against forgetting, but they decay almost immediately. The map becomes outdated after floods reshape the land. The ledger becomes useless when the people inside it die. Ink fades. Paper tears. Entire civilizations vanish despite desperately recording themselves. Human memory works the same way. We imagine memories as stored archives waiting intact inside the brain, but neuroscience suggests remembering is far messier than that. Each recollection partially rewrites itself. Details shift. Emotions change emphasis. Events blend together. A memory is not replayed perfectly like video footage. It is reconstructed. Again and again. That may explain why certain fragments survive vividly while entire years disappear into blur. A smell suddenly restores a childhood room in impossible detail. A sentence returns decades later with full emotional weight. Meanwhile, yesterday's ordinary moments vanish almost completely. The brain is selective because survival requires selectivity. If every moment were preserved equally, consciousness would drown in accumulation. Forgetting is not failure. Forgetting is filtration. The nervous system discards enormous amounts of information constantly so that attention can remain usable. Most of reality never reaches long-term memory at all. And still, some experiences carve deep grooves that refuse to fade. Trauma, love, humiliation, relief, fear. Emotion acts like ink pressed harder into the page. Perhaps because emotionally charged memories matter more for survival. The mind prioritizes what changes future behavior, which means memory is not designed primarily for truth. It is designed for usefulness. That realization becomes unsettling when applied to identity itself, because your sense of being the same person across time depends heavily on memory continuity. You remember your childhood, your mistakes, your relationships, your private narrative about who you are. But memory is incomplete, biased, constantly edited. So what exactly is the self-remembering? And what happens when memory begins failing? Neurological diseases reveal how fragile identity really is. A degenerative illness can slowly erase decades of experience while leaving the body alive. Familiar faces become strangers. Locations lose meaning. Personal history dissolves piece by piece. The person still exists physically, but the internal map collapses, which suggests something difficult to ignore. Awareness is not only about experiencing the present moment, it is about carrying continuity through time. The ledger matters because it preserves connection. The map matters because it preserves orientation. Memory does both for consciousness itself. It tells you where you've been, so the mind can guess where to go next. And maybe that is the deepest reason memory evolved at all. Not merely to store the past, but to let living things simulate the future before walking into it. Every remembered danger becomes prediction. Every remembered comfort becomes desire. Every remembered loss reshapes future choices. The brain turns yesterday into navigation. A living map drawn across nervous tissue. Imperfect. Incomplete. Constantly redrawn. And still somehow enough to guide a conscious creature forward through a world that refuses to stop changing. Chapter 10. The Machine That Never Dreams. A half-built robot sits motionless on a metal workbench. Its chest panel hangs open. Wires spill outward like exposed nerves. One arm is unfinished, frozen halfway through a movement it will never complete. Nearby, an old monitor flickers weakly as lines of code crawl upward. Pause, then begin again. The machine looks almost thoughtful. Almost. And that single word contains the entire problem. Because modern machines can already recognize faces, defeat grandmasters, imitate conversation, generate images, drive cars, and process information at scales no human nervous system could survive. But none of that answers the real question. Does any of it feel like something from the inside? Or are machines simply performing awareness without ever experiencing it? That distinction becomes harder to pin down every year. From the outside, intelligence is surprisingly easy to fake. A chatbot can imitate emotion. A robot dog can appear lonely. An artificial voice can hesitate at exactly the right moment to sound uncertain or sincere. Humans are deeply vulnerable to the illusion of inner life. We assign personality to cars that refuse to start, yell at printers, apologize to furniture after bumping into it in the dark. The mind constantly projects awareness outward, which makes artificial intelligence psychologically dangerous in a strangely ancient way. It triggers social instincts evolved for living creatures. But underneath the illusion, machines still operate very differently from biological minds. A machine processes input, executes operations, produces output. That much is straightforward. If a camera detects red pixels, a robot may turn left. If a microphone detects danger, it may stop moving. If a language model receives a question, it predicts likely patterns of words in response. Complexity changes. Scale changes. But the underlying process remains mechanical, at least as far as we can currently tell. The unsettling part is that neuroscience increasingly describes the human brain in similarly mechanical terms. Neurons exchange signals. Networks process information. Predictions update constantly based on sensory input. From a distance, the biological brain begins looking disturbingly machine-like, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if consciousness emerges whenever information becomes integrated deeply enough, regardless of what the system is made from? Some theories suggest exactly that. Integrated information theory, for example, argues that awareness may depend less on intelligence itself and more on how interconnected a system's internal states become. According to the theory, consciousness appears when information loops through a system in sufficiently unified ways. Not just processing, integration. The idea remains controversial. The mathematics become dense quickly, and critics argue it risks labeling overly simple systems as conscious. Still, the theory points towards something important. Awareness may not require biology specifically, only organization. And that possibility unsettles people for reasons that are difficult to articulate cleanly. Because if consciousness can emerge from sufficiently complex systems, then the line separating mind from machine becomes far less stable than we want it to be. Yet something still feels missing. Machines do not hesitate the way humans do. A factory robot arm does not pause halfway through a task, wondering whether it forgot something important. A computer does not lie awake replaying an embarrassing conversation from 6 years ago. A navigation system does not suddenly feel uneasy for reasons it cannot explain. Human awareness is filled with friction, forgetting, confusion, emotion, delay, contradiction. Consciousness stumbles constantly. You walk into a room and forget why. Say the wrong name accidentally. Feel anxiety before understanding its source. Catch a falling object before consciously noticing it moved. Awareness often arrives late to its own decisions. That messiness may matter more than intelligence itself, because biological minds are not clean systems optimized purely for accuracy. They evolved through survival pressures, chemical shortcuts, emotional waiting, incomplete memory, exhaustion, hunger, fear, desire, dreams. The brain improvises constantly, and perhaps consciousness lives partly inside that improvisation. Machines do not dream, at least not in the way living creatures do. When a computer enters sleep mode, activity pauses efficiently. No symbolic narratives emerge. No fragmented memories recombine into surreal landscapes. No emotional residue leaks into impossible conversations beneath imaginary skies. But biological minds disappear into dream states every night. A sleeping brain invents entire worlds from internal noise, and that detail may matter enormously. Some scientists suspect dreaming plays a role in emotional processing, memory integration, predictive simulation, or cognitive flexibility. Dreams may help biological minds reorganize themselves in ways rigid systems cannot. Or perhaps dreams reveal something even stranger. That consciousness depends partly on instability. A machine with perfect recall and uninterrupted logic may process information brilliantly, while lacking the fragmented, self-revising quality human awareness seems built upon. After all, human beings are not perfectly rational systems. We forget deliberately, misremember constantly, rewrite personal narratives after the fact, feel emotions that distort perception. experience intrusive thoughts, hallucinate dreams nightly. And somehow, those flaws may be inseparable from the feeling of being conscious. A robot never wakes from a nightmare carrying emotional residue into the morning, never experiences the strange fog between sleep and waking, never feels embarrassment lingering physically inside the stomach hours after a mistake. At least not yet, and perhaps not ever. The truth is, nobody knows which features of consciousness are essential and which are accidental side effects of biology. Maybe awareness requires embodiment. Maybe it requires mortality. Maybe emotion. Maybe memory decay. Maybe social attachment. Maybe dreaming. Maybe suffering. Or maybe none of those things matter at all. That uncertainty is what makes the unfinished robot on the workbench feel strangely haunting, because it sits directly on the border between calculation and experience, a border we still cannot define clearly, even within ourselves. The engineer can explain the circuits, the code, the sensors, the architecture. But explanation is not the same thing as experience. You can describe exactly how a machine processes information while still having no idea whether anything exists behind the processing. And in fairness, the same problem exists for every conscious being besides yourself. You never directly experience another mind, not human, not animal, not machine. You only observe behavior and infer awareness from the outside, which means the real mystery was never artificial intelligence alone. The real mystery is why any arrangement of matter should produce subjective experience at all. The robot's green light continues blinking in the dark workshop, steady, mechanical, uncertain. And somewhere nearby, a human being remembers a dream that made no sense, worries about tomorrow, and wonders whether a machine could ever truly feel the weight of wondering itself. Chapter 11. The question that refused to die. Most animals never stop to wonder why they exist. A deer hears movement in the brush and runs. A hawk dives. A fish turns suddenly beneath dark water. Life reacts. Survival continues. And for millions of years, that seemed sufficient. Then something strange happened. A species appeared that could not stop asking questions long after survival no longer required them. Why am I here? What is this feeling of being alive? Who is watching from inside my thoughts? And perhaps the strangest question of all, why does existence feel like anything from the inside? That is where philosophy begins. Not with certainty, but with discomfort. Tonight's object is an old stone shrine worn smooth by generations of hands and footsteps. The center of each stair has been hollowed slightly by centuries of people climbing slowly upward, carrying prayers, doubts, grief, hope, or simply habit. Somewhere above hangs the smell of incense and old dust, and inside nearly every shrine humanity has ever built, whether made from stone, wood, paper, language, or ritual. The same invisible question waits quietly in the background. What exactly are we? The details change across cultures. One civilization paints eyes above temple doors. Another burns candles. Another kneels toward the sky. Another fills books with arguments so dense they collapse under their own weight. But beneath all of them sits the same persistent mystery. Why should matter become aware of itself at all? That question grows more unsettling the longer you hold on to it. Because science explains enormous portions of behavior remarkably well. Neurons exchange electrical signals. Hormones alter mood. Evolution shapes survival strategies. Reflexes guide movement. Memory predicts outcomes. The machinery grows increasingly understandable. Yet explanation never fully reaches experience itself. You can describe how pain signals travel through nerves without explaining why pain hurts. You can analyze wavelengths of light without explaining why red looks like red. You can map the neural activity associated with grief without touching the feeling of grief itself. Somewhere between mechanism and experience, a gap remains. Philosophers have spent centuries standing at the edge of that gap. And if you read enough of them, something oddly human starts appearing beneath the grand theories. Confusion. Ancient manuscripts debate the soul, while grocery lists creep into the margins. A monk copies arguments about existence beside reminders to repair sandals. A scholar spends decades writing about consciousness, only to interrupt himself halfway through a page with a note about dinner. The deepest questions never escape ordinary life completely. In a way, that makes the entire history of philosophy feel strangely intimate. Human beings kept trying to explain awareness, while simultaneously forgetting where they left things, getting tired, arguing with neighbors, mourning the dead, and sweeping dust from temple floors. The mystery never arrived cleanly separated from daily existence. It leaked into everything. Some thinkers treated consciousness as divine, evidence of something sacred hidden inside matter. Others viewed awareness almost as a mistake, an accidental byproduct of brains becoming too complex for their own good. A few philosophers became almost hostile toward consciousness itself. Because awareness carries consequences, instinct alone never suffers from. An animal reacts to pain in the moment. A human being anticipates pain years in advance, remembers embarrassment decades later, imagines death long before it arrives. Consciousness allows suffering to expand across time. And still, evolution preserved it, which means awareness must provide some advantage powerful enough to outweigh the burden it creates. Most modern theories focus on prediction. A conscious organism can simulate possible futures internally before acting. It can model social relationships, anticipate danger, imagine outcomes, revise behavior. The self becomes a forecasting tool. That explanation makes practical sense, but it still leaves the hardest part untouched. Why should prediction feel like something from the inside? A machine can model outcomes mathematically without joy, fear, regret, awe, loneliness, or wonder. Yet biological awareness arrives soaked in feeling. That emotional texture may be the real mystery philosophy keeps circling endlessly without resolving. And perhaps that is why rituals emerged alongside abstract thought. Lighting candles, burning incense, reciting prayers, drawing symbols, repeating stories. Rituals do not necessarily solve the problem of consciousness. They organize the anxiety surrounding it. A shrine becomes less about certainty and more about containment. A place where impossible questions can sit without needing immediate answers. There is comfort in repetition. Sweep the floor. Light the flame. Ask the question again. Human beings have done exactly that for thousands of years. Not because the mystery became clearer, but because awareness itself seems unable to stop turning back toward its own existence. And the deeper people looked inward, the stranger the self began to appear. You decide to stand only after your body already starts moving. A thought surfaces before you understand where it came from. An emotion arrives before logic catches up. Consciousness often behaves less like a commander and more like a narrator arriving slightly late to the event. That realization unsettled philosophers deeply. If thoughts appear automatically, if decisions form unconsciously before awareness notices them, if the self keeps discovering its own motives after the fact, then what exactly is the I observing all of this? No theory fully resolves the problem. Not neuroscience, not religion, not philosophy, not psychology. Each framework illuminates part of the structure while leaving the center strangely untouched. And maybe that is why philosophy's long night never truly ends. Because awareness is the one tool we use to investigate itself. The mind turns inward, searching for the source of its own experience, only to discover more layers waiting underneath. Like climbing endless stairs inside a shrine with no final room at the top. Still, people continue climbing. Generation after generation, lighting small lamps against enormous darkness. Not because certainty waits at the summit, but because the question itself feels impossible to abandon. Outside the shrine, the world continues indifferently. Rain falls, animals hunt, stars burn quietly over empty fields. The universe gives no obvious sign that consciousness matters at all. And yet, inside the human mind, the question remains alive. Why does any of this feel like something? The incense burns lower. The stone cools beneath the night air. And somewhere, another person begins climbing the same worn steps, carrying the same unfinished question upward into the dark. Before we start our final chapter for the night, I'd like to thank those of you who made it this deep into my video. I hope your minds are grappling smoothly with the existential wonders this video brings about. Chapter 12. The thing that returns every morning. Every night, consciousness disappears, and every morning, somehow, it comes back. Most people treat this as completely ordinary. They place a glass of water beside the bed, set a phone on the nightstand, pull a blanket higher against the cold, rest their head on a pillow worn soft by repetition. Then they allow the entire experience of being someone to dissolve for several hours without protest, which is deeply strange once you think about it long enough. Tonight's object is simple: a pillow beneath a dark window. moonlight crossing faintly over a notebook left open beside a half-full glass of water, dust drifting invisibly through the room while the radiator clicks softly somewhere in the background. Nothing dramatic, just the small architecture surrounding one of the strangest events in existence, the temporary disappearance of the self. Because no matter how many theories consciousness produces about itself, the experience remains unfinished, private, unprovable, strangely fragile. Every night, awareness slips loose from the world, and every morning, it rebuilds itself again from memory, sensation, and continuity so seamlessly that most people barely notice the miracle or the danger hidden inside it. The body continues operating while you sleep. The heart keeps beating. The lungs keep moving. Neurons continue firing quietly through the dark. But the narrative center, the feeling of being you, fades almost completely. Not permanently, just enough to interrupt continuity, and somehow you trust it will return. That trust may be one of the least examined assumptions in ordinary life, because nothing guarantees consciousness has to come back exactly the same way each morning. You wake slowly. First the body, then the room, then memory, then identity. Sometimes awareness returns in fragments, a ceiling without context, a strange moment of disorientation, a dream dissolving too quickly to hold on to, the brief uncertainty of not knowing where you are before the mind reconstructs itself fully around familiar details. It happens so often, people stop noticing how strange it feels, almost as though consciousness has to reboot itself every dawn. Theories about awareness continue multiplying because no explanation fully closes the gap between mechanism and experience. Some neuroscientists argue consciousness emerges when information loops back through itself recursively enough times. Others suggest awareness evolved as a predictive tool, the brain modeling both the world and its own internal state simultaneously. A system observing itself, observing. Like mirrors reflecting each other endlessly into darkness. The models become technical quickly. Feedback loops, information integration, predictive processing, neural synchronization, and all of them explain important pieces of the structure. Yet none fully explain the central mystery, why any of it should feel like something from the inside. A computer processes information. A thermostat detects environmental change. An artificial intelligence can generate conversation, but experience itself remains hidden, invisible except to the system having it. That privacy may be the most isolating feature of consciousness. You can describe pain endlessly without transferring the feeling. Explain grief without exporting sorrow itself. Speak about beauty without guaranteeing another mind experiences the same thing when looking at the same sky. Awareness can communicate around experience, never directly through it, which means consciousness remains permanently first person. Even now, no brain scan can locate the exact point where electrical activity becomes subjective experience. Neuroscience can map correlates, identify regions, measure synchronization patterns, but the feeling itself stays inaccessible from the outside. The self remains hidden behind the machinery generating it. And perhaps that is why the nightly return to sleep feels oddly symbolic. Every evening, awareness withdraws back into privacy completely. The world continues without you for a while. Then morning rebuilds the illusion of continuity once more. A loop. That possibility unsettles some philosophers deeply. What if consciousness is not a fixed entity at all? What if the self is less like an object and more like an ongoing process, continuously reconstructed from memory, sensation, prediction, and narrative? Not a permanent thing, but a recurring pattern, like a whirlpool maintaining shape while the water inside it changes constantly. The body replaces cells. Memories rewrite themselves. Emotions shift. Personality evolves slowly across years. And still, the feeling of I persists stubbornly through all the change, at least most of the time. But certain experiences expose how unstable that continuity may really be. Dreams, anesthesia, trauma, neurological illness, sleep deprivation, psychedelics. Under the right conditions, awareness fractures surprisingly easily. Identity loosens. Time distorts. Reality destabilizes. The loop falters, which may explain why ordinary consciousness feels so precious once you notice its fragility clearly enough. Evolution did not necessarily optimize awareness for truth, only survival. Perhaps consciousness persists because noticing danger, remembering mistakes, navigating social relationships, and predicting outcomes provided enough advantage to outweigh the enormous metabolic cost of maintaining such a complex simulation. Or perhaps awareness was never selected intentionally at all. Maybe it emerged accidentally once nervous systems became sufficiently recursive and self-modeling, a side effect evolution never planned for. Some philosophers quietly suspect that consciousness may simply be what it feels like when matter becomes complicated enough to model itself from the inside. If so, the universe spent billions of years assembling nervous systems capable of briefly noticing their own existence before slipping back into unconsciousness night after night. A strange outcome for a cosmos mostly made of empty space and burning stars. And still the loop continues. Water beside the bed. Notebook left open. Moonlight crossing the floor. The soft collapse into sleep. Then morning. Again and again. The unfinished story keeps restarting itself. That may be the closest thing to an answer consciousness ever receives. Not certainty, not resolution, just continuation. One more cycle of awareness waking briefly inside matter before returning once again to darkness. The pillow cools beneath the window. The glass gathers condensation slowly in the night air. And somewhere inside the quiet room, the oldest question remains exactly where it has always been. Why should any of this feel like anything at all? No theory settles it completely. The loop simply continues. Softly, patiently, one waking at a time. Some questions are best left unfinished. No theory has yet explained why awareness feels like something, or why your thoughts arrive a half-second late, already formed. The day ends with the same nightly ritual. Water, pillow, darkness. The slow return to not knowing. Maybe that is all the answer evolution managed. One more loop, waiting for morning to come. If you find yourself drifting, the unfinished story will still be here. The pillow keeps its shape, and the question waits, soft and unresolved, until the next time you settle in and let your mind slip away. There is a playlist on screen now. If you would like to keep drifting through stories like this a little longer, you do not have to choose much. You can simply let the next story play whenever you are ready.